A to jest sesja lub warsztat siódmy of Warsztaty pisania tekstów naukowych, or workshops on the writing of scientific texts. This should be a little shorter lecture than the previous lecture. Today we'll be looking at what I describe here as language problems, or more specifically problems of register, jargons, what I would call allusions, and finally how to prepare abstracts if you have to prepare literature in the medium of English. Why do you need this lecture? Well, increasingly, as we've discussed throughout this workshop series, scientific literature is being published in English, and the system used here in Poland, for example, which rates the quality of your scientific output, is very much weighted towards English language publications. And of course, just more generally, English has become the so-called universal language of scientific discourse in Europe increasingly. And if you have to produce literature in English, even if it's only a short abstract to describe a longer article written in Polish or German, for example, you still need to know how to be clear, and you need to avoid some of the most common pitfalls that young academics especially fall prey to. And these include things such as the hazards of trying to sound natural, and knowing when it's okay to deviate from what I've described before as the generic pattern of an article. Now, I suggest here an online source created by Lund University specifically to help students who are not native English speakers to learn how to write effectively in the scientific language of English. The link here is current. This information was originally put on Lund University's website back in 2011, but it's updated constantly. So it's a good, reliable guide just for non-native speakers. You've probably heard this term register used before in the course of a English language class. Register is, of course, the English term used to define the different range of vocabulary that can be used to say the same thing, depending on context, purpose, or audience. So on the one hand, you can have casual speech, which is very informal. This might be the way in which you speak to the general public at a non-academic event where you want to reach the broadest possible audience with descriptions of your work and your conclusions. And this will tend to use sort of shorter words that are more easily understood by the general public. And then at the other extreme, you'll have a chapter from your PhD thesis or an academic journal where you tend to use very formal and specialist language. And conference papers fit somewhere in the middle. At conferences, generally speaking, you will have a kind of mix of specialisms, and not everyone in the room will be familiar with all of the nuances of your work, and so you have to strike a kind of balanced line between informal and formal speech. I would tell you with absolute certainty that it is always better to be more formal in your speech, to use more formal grammar, and to speak in a so-called higher formal register as opposed to preferring the informal. It's better to leave the audience at a conference asking themselves what certain specialist terms mean, because they can always ask you what they mean in the questions afterwards. It's better that the audience be asking themselves what specialist terms mean than that they be sitting there wondering why you don't know the specialist vocabulary surrounding your own field. I give you an example here of the difference between informal and formal speech. So these two sentences say the same thing. The first one here, it's clear after looking through the court cases that the numbers show a real trend towards a greater use of debt lawsuits between people. You'll note here that the words are more numerous, but they tend to be smaller words that are generally better known to younger people or persons without a university education. And these smaller words in the English language tend to be those with Anglo-Saxon roots. That is to say, those with more Germanic roots prior to the late medieval French and Latin influence on the English language. The more formal way of saying the same thing would be, a survey of judicial records indicates definitively a relative increase in interpersonal litigation. Note here that we've used 13 words instead of 24. This is very helpful if you're writing an academic article where you're often constrained by word limits, but also the words themselves tend to be those with Latin or French roots. Note here, for example, the words judicial or interpersonal or litigation. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to both a lower register and a higher register of language. If we're talking about this kind of lower register of language, you sound approachable. This can be very useful if you're at a public engagement event. You sound more approachable. This comforts listeners and tends to avoid listeners sort of switching off, as we say. You reach a wider audience by doing that. You in turn generate greater impact. And again, impact is a word that is being used increasingly by national governments and by institutions that grant funding for academic research. Impact is currently being defined as a demonstrable, quantifiable change in the opinion of others. Note that impact is increasingly assessed, but at the same time, not necessarily useful for advancing your field. If I can explain that a little more fully, for example, you might publish a piece of research which doesn't really bring much new information into the scientific community, but because it's on a topic which is very popular, say some aspect of the Second World War, and it reaches a wide audience, it could change the opinions of that wide audience who come in contact with it. Again, while not really adding much to what the academic community already knows. On the other hand, sometimes very important discoveries in the social sciences are ones that will not be of interest to the general public. And so if you keep in mind this idea that impact is something that can be quantitatively assessed, that is to say, we can count the number of persons whose opinions have been changed, you'll find that sometimes very good academic literature reaches very few people. It only reaches specialists, and it doesn't do much to change the minds of ordinary people. And so there's a balancing act here. You can have a mediocre research with a high quantifiable impact, but you can also have very good research with a very low quantifiable impact. And so that's a very difficult thing to balance. Your desire to achieve impact and thereby to advance your career versus your desire to make really profound discoveries. In an ideal world, you can do both, but very often you can't. Now, using informal or the informal or lower register is very helpful when you're communicating research to the general public to generate impact. If you're a historian and you want to go speak at a city event about the history of the city, then you need to formulate your work in a low register so that the average person can understand it. Some disadvantages to operating at a lower register: you tend to say less and to use more words while doing it. recall for a moment the example I gave on the previous slide, where I have effectively communicated the same information twice, in a low register using 24 words, and then in a higher register using only 13 words, but the information communicated is the same. In the English language, most words in a low register tend to be imprecise and so prone to potential incorrect interpretations. Most specialist vocabulary is in a high register and has Latin or French roots. Say, for example, on the previous slide, I stated the same information twice, and in the low register example, I said court cases. Court cases, that phrase describes when one person is challenging another in court, but court cases can be about all kinds of things. And sometimes court cases can be between the state and an individual, for example. Whereas in the high register example I gave, I used the terms interpersonal litigation. Litigation is very specifically between two persons. Instead of mentioning courts in general, I specifically said judicial records rather than court records. Again, there's a subtle difference there, but the high register vocabulary is more specific. Court records contain many different kinds of information, but judicial records tell us about judicial process only, the process of settling a dispute between individuals or between an individual and a state in modern language, for the most part. If we look at the use of a high register or a formal register, it's concise. We can communicate more information with fewer words. It tends to be more accurate. This limits potential lines of criticism. It's a shame if you have an important scientific finding to communicate and you write it in a low register and that finds its way into publication, and then as a result of misunderstanding, your work is criticized. Always better to be more accurate. Keep in mind that these two words, concise and accurate, have very different meanings. Concise is to say more with fewer words. Accurate is to communicate something in a way that it cannot possibly be misunderstood. It has the smallest number of interpretations. I would advise you, when writing academic literature in a high register, a formal register, to use more universal words. And in English, high register words tend to be the more universal words in the English language. For example, communication in English, comunicacja, for Polsku, of course, comunicazione in Italian, or comunicaton in German. There are, of course, disadvantages to operating in a high register. You can sound like you're trying to, if you'll forgive the colloquialism here, as Americans say, blind them with bullshit. And this is a particular American sickness, whereby social science literature in North America has a tendency to use more of these sort of very long Latin-based words than is necessary, so much so that it becomes increasingly difficult for non-specialists to understand the results they're trying to read in a journal or a book as they go along. And this can limit your audience, and if you use a lot of these words without explanation, then you're tending towards what we call jargon. Now, jargon can be defined as specialized terminology specific to your field. And what qualifies as jargon is subjective, not objective. That is to say, it depends on context. As a medieval economic historian, I might say to you this sentence: de donis conditionalibus, entrenched sub infeudation and enabled social closure by inter vivos means. if you are not a medieval economic historian, and if you're not a British historian, then these terms dedonis conditionalibus, or inter vivos, or even social closure, if you're not familiar with sociology, will probably leave you thinking, I have no idea what that means. On the other hand, in the context of teaching this course, it would not be jargon to say the EU has given some money to UMK to conduct research. Because as a group, we are all familiar with what the EU is because we're living in it. And as students of Warsztaty Mikrokerka, we all know what UMK is. And so for us, this isn't a jargon-laden sentence. But to someone reading it, for example, in, I don't know, Canada or somewhere, they wouldn't understand what the UMK was. And so for them, it would be full of jargon. So the difficulty here is understanding your own audience. You really have to consider your audience. You want to make sure when you're writing, or especially when you're giving a conference paper, that the audience is not going to receive or hear what you're saying as jargon, that they're going to know what those terms mean from their own context. Remember, Anglo-American societies are what we call high context societies. And so there is an impetus when you're writing for a journal article, for example, to define your potential jargon at the first usage. It would be normal, even with something as straightforward as the EU, it would be normal to write the sentence below: the European Union, round bracket EU, round bracket is the largest, and we could say the largest political entity in Europe. This method of putting of using round brackets immediately after a term to contain the acronym is very common. If we're trying to define a term that can't be made into an acronym, for example, the Latin term inter vivos that we often use in discussing the medieval economy, then the tendency in English is to put in this phrase, that is, and then a definition between commas. So inter vivos transfers that is between two living persons, were of key importance. And so this is a very typical construction. We have the vocabulary term comes first, and it's immediately followed by that is, which used to be written i.e. id est, Latin, and then the definition between two persons. A good rule of thumb when you're asking yourself if you need to define a term, I find is to say, would a second-year university student in your field understand it? It's too much when you're writing an academic article to ask if the average person in your country would understand it, because then you'd have to define pretty much everything. But if you imagine a university student who has had that one first year of university to learn the general shape of your field, if they wouldn't understand it, then you need to define it. I think that's a good measure. The next topic I want to talk about is what we might call allusions. And these are things that I define as allusions because you think they might help. You think they might help you in communicating your research, but in reality, they do not help you. And so you'll see some no's on this page. I put in bold red type here. There is the temptation to try and sound more natural, but to think that this would help you is a kind of illusion. You do not want to sound natural. In fact, you don't need to sound natural. What you need is to be clear. You need to communicate in a way that is concise and accurate. Because even though language teachers will often say it's important to, quote, sound natural, what sounds natural to an academic in one field versus an academic in another field versus a person on the street. And these are all completely different things. To try and quote sound natural is an impossible task because it depends on your audience. It's subjective. But what's objective, what you can achieve, is to be concise and to be accurate. And I give you some examples of things you do not want to do. So you want to avoid saying things like smaller companies came into the process by the back door, or the stock market was given a good hiding by short sellers. You know, you might think that by constructing sentences like this with colloquialisms, it sounds more natural. But what you find is that very often for non-English speakers, it's as likely to go wrong as it is to go right. And I say don't take that chance. Be formal, be concise, be accurate, and you'll ultimately be better respected. Alternative words. This is something else that's a bit of an illusion. Say you're writing in English, for example, and you have at your disposal knowledge given to you, say, by an English teacher in a gymnasium, something like this. And probably you have had an English teacher that says to you, make your writing in English interesting by using different words. English has so many instances in which you have 2 or 3 words with the same meaning. So try and make your literature interesting by mixing them up, by using different ones. Do not do that. That's, again, it's a kind of illusion. Students who are trying to learn to speak casually are told this, but in science, it's not a good idea. It is completely okay to use the same key terms again and again. In a complex scientific argument, it is in fact helpful for clarity if you define something with a key term and then use that term again and again. Don't be alarmed by this. You're not writing literature for entertainment. This is science. I can remember, for example, being told by my own PhD supervisor in Wales when I was in the latter stages of my PhD, and I was feeling frustrated that I had to repeat certain terms again and again, and I was trying to find creative ways to use different words where I could. And my supervisor actually said to me, stop doing this. You're making your work less clear. And that was advice from one native speaker to another. The last thing I put here on my list of absolute no's is humor. It feels like it would be a good idea at a conference to try and slip in a joke. Don't do it. Just don't do it. Particularly in a European context, what you'll find is often you'll be at a large international conference, say you're in France or Germany, half of the speakers are native speakers, half are not. Even if you get the joke formulated correctly in English, probably half of the people in the room whose first language is not English still won't understand the joke. It's just awkward. Don't do it. And certainly do not try and formulate something humorous in the written word. Just avoid it. More things that you really must not do. Do not use what are described in English as literary devices. I've put here a link, or you can type this into your address bar in your browser, an address for a website here with a list of 31 literary devices which the author, Ms. Munz, says you should know. I put it to you that as scientists, as social scientists, you should not know them and you should not use them. This is a list of sins to be avoided at all costs. Allegory, allusion, colloquialisms, which I've already mentioned, foreshadowing and symbolism, avoid them all. You are writing scientific literature, not fiction for entertainment here. Something that's a little more subtle, but very much in the same camp here is moral judgment. It's very easy, without even realizing that you're doing it, to include moral judgments in your interpretation of the data. Avoid this at all costs. Notice the difference between the two sentences I give you here. Sentence 1. King Edward's cynical decision to liberate English debtors by expropriating mortgages owed to Jewish creditors, so on and so forth. Now, it may well be that most readers will find it cynical that the English king liberated debtors by effectively making himself the creditor to those same debtors in favor of expelled English Jews. It might be that 99 out of 100 readers will find that a deeply cynical and evil thing to have done. However, it is not your job to make that judgment. Absolutely not. And in fact, if you do that often, not only will your reviewers complain about it when they're examining your PhD or writing an article, in fact, if you have a tendency to include moral judgments, small as they may be, and even when you think it's very obvious, if you have a tendency to include moral judgment statements like this, you'll be viewed as unprofessional and your work may be rejected for publication. I think increasingly there's a pressure, or young people feel pressure when they're preparing scientific writing, to include small moral judgment statements, because on social media, for example, if you watch an information program on YouTube, particularly in English, there's a real culture now of people trying to say what they think the audience wants to hear. Because there's such a culture of judging the views of others, people feel it's important to say, oh, I find this cynical because I'm a good person, and any good person would find this cynical, because they're scared someone might judge them. But in scientific literature, you really must avoid kind of moral judgment statements. I give you an alternative here. King Edward's decision to liberate English debtors from Jewish creditors through the expropriation of mortgages enriched the crown at no financial benefit to debtors. So this communicates exactly the same information, but without the moral judgment. It allows the reader to make the judgment for themselves. There's some allusions of a more subtle nature that you need to be aware of. These are things that you're more likely to have encountered in English language classes. At the top of my list here, be aware that adjectives are not your friends. There is a tendency to hear words again and again and again, and then to feel comfortable with those words because they're so often spoken or in the media, and so we casually write them, assuming that these are not slang, that they're not controversial, when in fact they are slang, or they tend to overstate your position. These are some of the most commonly misused adjectives I see in the writing even of native English speakers. The word massive to describe something which is very large or very important is incorrect. If something is massive, it is an item of great mass. That is to say, like a planet or a stone wall. Massive should be used only in its technical sense to communicate something which is very dense and heavy. Again, students tend to say things like, it was completely incorrect for person A to have done something in the past. If this were a history essay, for example, never say completely. It makes yourself vulnerable to criticism. If you use a sweeping term like completely to describe anything, there is probably an exception out there. Find a word that describes very narrowly and specifically what you're talking about. Do not make what we call sweeping statements. It's never all, it's never nothing, it's never completely. You need a more narrow and accurate term. Again, awesome is very often misused. Awesome technically means something which puts you in awe. For example, if a person were to witness a nuclear explosion, it would probably put them in a state of awe, which means to be in a state where their mind is finding it difficult to comprehend what they're seeing because it's so overwhelming. Minute is often misused. Minute means something that's very, very small physically, and words like normal are often misused as well, because normal, of course, is subjective. There is no universal standard for normal. If you're going to use the word normal in scientific literature, then you need at some point to have defined what normal is in the context of your work. For example, if you're doing statistical research on the economy, you might have a section of the essay in which you establish statistically what is quote unquote normal, what is the most common level of economic activity, for example. But even then, you really shouldn't use normal. You should say, most common or standard, something like that. That is to say, try to avoid using adjectives which can be seen subjectively. Only use ones which can be seen objectively if at all possible. There's some issues here, there's some problems here with British and American English. I would say when you're preparing your thesis, but more specifically when you're writing for scientific journals, stick to the style guide. All journals will have usually quite a lengthy document telling you exactly how to prepare your text. If you send literature to a journal without having checked the style guide, probably the journal will send your article back and tell you to format it to the style guide before they'll even look at it. And style guides can be very particular. They might want specific spellings. They might want slightly unusual grammatical forms. Often the antiquity of a journal. For example, if it's a journal that's been around for 120 years, then it will have more odd and unusual requirements. If you're uncertain about something, look where the journal is published. If it's published in Britain, or if it's published in America. And even if it's published in Britain, be sensitive to whether it's published at Oxford or Cambridge University presses, or with a different British publisher. I'm going to give you some examples here of why it's important to note those distinctions. Oxford and Cambridge represent and use a very old style of the English language. And in fact, most Americanisms or most American ways of writing and most American uses of grammar tend to be the same as Oxford and Cambridge. What's happened actually is that the British English has kind of moved on, as it were, and modernized in certain ways when American English is stuck in its colonial past. So some commonalities arise between American English and Oxford-Cambridge style due to the conservative, old-fashioned nature of Oxford and Cambridge and the old-fashioned nature of English in America. So the quote Oxford comma is used in both American style and in Oxford and Cambridge style. That is to say, where you have a list of 3 or more items, you put and before the last item in the list, and in the American or Oxford and Cambridge style, you insert a comma after the word preceding and, as you see here. 1, 2, and 3 9. That is the so-called Oxford comma. Style guides will simply say very often, use the Oxford comma or do not use the Oxford comma. And so you really need to know what it is. Spellings where Z is used in preference to S are common in both America and Oxford and Cambridge, such as popularize, aggrandize, or analyze. And you can see below on this slide the S versions of those words. Possessive endings in Oxford and Cambridge style and in American style. Possessive endings in the singular use apostrophe S. So the size of Wales would be written as Wales's size, S apostrophe S. Now in the rest of Britain, outside of Oxford and Cambridge, S spellings are used. Again here, popularize, aggrandize, analyze. No Oxford comma, and possessive endings in the singular, where a word ends in S, are formulated simply by writing S apostrophe, similar to plural possessives. The size of Wales, or Wales's size, W-A-L-E-S apostrophe. Quotations in British English are placed between single inverted commas, and in American English between double inverted commas. Now, all this might seem like a very long list of no's and things not to do, but I want to set out that there are a few things you'll see in articles which are not problematic allusions, as it were. They're acceptable deviations from the standard pattern of an Anglo-American article, but they're really quite advanced techniques. I'd advise you to avoid them, but I give you a couple examples of ones here you're likely to see. So scene setting is a device that can be used for a more kind of advanced formulation of an article. This is to place at the beginning of an article an example of something. So the most common three kinds of examples I've put here. So you begin the article with an example of the evidence to be discussed. This might be a legal text or a literary passage or an anecdote. This foregrounds the nature of the evidence. Particularly if the article revolves around the interpretation of a very complex or idiosyncratic type of evidence, it's useful to give the reader right at the very start an example of one piece of that evidence so that the reader can more easily understand the explanation of the data used when that explanation is provided later in the article. You might alternatively open with key statistics. This usually is used to format a problem. So here are statistics we're familiar with, but they objectively don't make sense with our current understanding. Or to highlight a lacuna. Look, here are some statistics that indicate there were a lot of something, and therefore we should have looked at it in the past if we haven't. Lastly, you might open with a quotation from a key historian. This tends to be done where you want to formulate a problem essay, so an argument where a historian has indicated that there's a problem we've not yet solved, and this essay will solve it. Or you might start with a quote from a historian if you're going to build a straw man argument. You know, 100 years ago, a historian said this, and of course it's no longer true. If we look at the other end of a piece of academic writing, we find something that's another deviation from the generic pattern of the article, but this is one that's most common in what we might call harder social sciences like economics or sociology, where we say, look, effectively there's a divided conclusion. Now, normally we say of academic writing that it's a terrible sin to not give a clear conclusion, but particularly with a data-heavy piece of writing, you might find that there are two equally valid conclusions that could be reached by interpreting that data in one of two accepted ways. And this could be a piece of literature in which you are effectively setting up a problem. The whole point of the literature is to indicate to other scientists that there is a problem here, that there are two different ways to interpret this, and we don't yet have the tools. It's a kind of call to action for to get other academics to use your work as a starting point and move forward. It's a kind of a gamble. If you're thinking about the need for your research to be cited by a lot of other academics for your impact factor to grow and for your career to advance, then it's quite important, really, that you position yourself at the heart of an argument. And what better way to do that than to be the first person to point out that further work needs to be done, because thereafter everyone else who picks up that problem and addresses it will have to start by citing your literature. Now, all that having been said, the last thing I want to talk about briefly is how to write an abstract. We haven't talked about abstracts yet. We've talked about the way to formulate an article as a whole, and various ways you might build an argument within that article. But most journals in the social sciences, like those in the so-called hard sciences like physics and mathematics, now require an abstract where you summarize in just, say, 200 words or so, the content of your article. And I thought this was an important topic to discuss in this lecture, because abstracts need to be absolutely devoid, that is to say, absolutely without jargon. They need to be without allusion. They need to be absolutely direct. And therefore, because you only have this small number of words to work with, they need to be both concise and accurate. And that's typically achieved by using English in this higher register. So abstracts really are a best practice example of all of the advice I've given in the course of this lecture. I provide you here with a very recent and very good abstract. And you can see by breaking it down, as I've done here, inserting these words in red, the various main elements of an article in the typical Anglo-American tradition. But you can also see here very clearly the main elements of any good abstract. So it begins with the context. You know, this is an article about manor courts. Number two, it offers that key justification. Why do we need to look at this? Well, we need to look at it because there's a persistent debate. That is to say, a debate which is still current and still going on. That's the justification, but it also indicates to us the form of argument to come. As covered in the last lecture, a debate, an article where the argument is structured as a debate will tend to have certain characteristics. And because there's specialist vocabulary here, and of course we're in a high context academic environment, in a British journal such as this one, they stop to define a key term. What do they mean by personal actions? Next, we have the evidence section. So this is a data-driven article. They introduce you to the body of evidence. In this case, it's going to be a database of manor court evidence. Next, we have the conclusions presented to us in order from the least to the most specific, or from the least to the most important, in what we would call logical progression. That is to say, each one can only be understood by the reader if they're already familiar with the previous one. So we look at the last ones here. The very last line here, litigants and jurors of the manor courts played a decisive role in this process. That conclusion will only make sense to you if you've read the previous two sentences and you know the main conclusion and the process. So very nicely written abstract here, avoiding all of the potential problems I've indicated in this lecture. Again, no jargon, no creative vocabulary, and no literary devices. So what's next? Well, we have one lecture left on this course where I'll come back and talk a little bit about sort of formulating your research more generally. And so in terms of English language issues or structural issues within PhD chapters or articles, this is the last time I'll be talking about those things. And so I just want to leave you here with a little bit of good advice. What next, I've written? Well, don't trust translators, number one. If you have a general translation office at a university, translate your work into English, they almost certainly will not be familiar with your field. And so when you have an English translation, if something looks suspicious to you, usually coś podejrzane, you need to check it. You absolutely need to check it. That takes a little bit of confidence. Sometimes you really need to challenge the translator. You can help yourself really by making the translator's job as easy as possible. And you can do that by not using jargon, by using the same concise vocabulary again and again, and by avoiding vague or subjective adjectives, as I've indicated. I know this isn't easy and it's not always possible, but as you advance through your PhD and you make connections with other academics, try to make friends with a couple of Anglophone academics along the way. It's incredibly useful when you're writing in a second language to have someone to send material to, just to say, is this the right vocabulary? And indeed, imitate where appropriate. That is to say, if you have read 2 or 3 academic articles or books in your specific area of study, take the time to look at the way in which those articles and books describe the material that you're writing about. Imitate the kind of key phrases and vocabulary used in those books and articles written by native English speakers. No need to reinvent the wheel, as we say. That is to say, you don't have to come up with a good idea of the best way and the best adjectives to describe something. Look at the English language literature in that field and see what's being used currently. And I say here with a little bit of cynicism, I must admit, welcome to the age of Europeanization and globalization, in which English has become the so-called universal language, and in which you're going to be pressured to produce more and more writing in English, I'm afraid. But it is achievable, and you can produce good scientific literature in English as a second language with a bit of practice. Thank you for listening.